Hello, everybody, and welcome back from lunch. It's a little bit sad in COVID times. Lunch is not the best part of every conference anymore, sadly so. But luckily, we are about to delve into the session that will prove very, very interesting. My name is Alexandra Gese. I'm a German Green MEP dealing with digital affairs, and I'm very happy to be able to moderate this panel today. This panel is called Data Sovereignty, Data Innovation, and Building Trusted European Data Spaces. I think this is one of the most important topics we have currently. Just think about the debate about health data. Health data needs a trusted European space where citizens can really be sure that it is well treated and that we can use it for developing advanced solutions in order to improve our health situation. But as a German MEP, and therefore as a person coming from a country with a very strong industrial basis, I'm obviously also very interested in making sure that European companies have a place where to store and process and analyze and share their important industrial data. And therefore, I'm very, very happy to be able to discuss these issues today with very distinguished guests. So we have, first of all, Mr. Ivo Vollmann, Acting Director of DG Connect of the European Commission. Welcome. Then Kaspar Klinge, Vice President of European Government Affairs at Microsoft. Welcome. Professor Dr. Boris Otto, member of the interim management team and acting interim CTO of the Gaia X project. Welcome, Professor Otto. I think we're all very curious to hear more about Gaia X. And Andreas Tegge, Head of Global Government Relations, SAP. Welcome, good to have you. And last but not least, Marianne Terveen, Director Data Sharing Lead at InnoPay. Great to have you all here. We have some time for your opening remarks. After that, we will be taking questions from the audience. So if you want to submit questions, do so. I'll be very happy to ask them to these distinguished speakers. And now it's time for the opening remarks on the side of the European Commission. Ivo, you have the floor.
Yeah, many thanks, Alexandra. So over the last year, data has really taken a central place in the digital policies of the Commission, and there are actually very good reasons for that. Well, data is going to help us to live longer and healthier lives. Well, you've seen already how data can support the fight against the COVID virus. Data will help us to reduce energy consumption and to move around faster and more efficiently in town. And apart from the enormous societal potential, data has a big economic potential in terms of innovation and new products, for example, based on artificial intelligence. No artificial intelligence without data. Of course, this is important for jobs creation, and more in general, data is going to contribute to the efficiency of Europe's industry. Now, this was recognized by the European Council. There was strong support in the October European Council conclusions for the European data strategy and for the topic of data sharing. And the thing is, the potential that is there is only going to materialize if we take the right steps. And that's why in the data strategy of February last year, the Commission has outlined a vision for data. And this vision is about creating a European data space, a real single market for data where data can flow across borders and across sectors, where there's ample of data available for use, where European values and rules are fully respected. I'm thinking in particular about privacy rules, and where there's clear rules for the access and use of data. Now, there's some work to be done in those areas, and that's why the strategy outlines a number of actions. And the first pillar is about getting the legal framework right, a cross-sectoral governance framework for access and use of data. We have made a first proposal in November for a Data Governance Act, and of course, the Digital Markets Act, the proposal for that came out in December about gatekeepers. That's also about data partly. Then a second pillar is about investments in data infrastructures. And Boris is going to talk about that when talking about Gaia X. Let's not forget the competences, making sure, of course, that we have the data analysts and the highbrow data people, but also that there is in general data skills, digital skills, data literacy that is so necessary. And last but not least, the rollout of common European data spaces, because, well, the health data, you cannot be treated in the same way as industrial data. They're different in terms of who is going to decide about it, and whether it's personal data, whether it's sensitive data or not. Sorry, that's why you need an approach that is tailored to the data spaces without creating new silos. That's really important. Now, giving individuals and companies more control over their data, doing data in a European way, in full respect of our values. I think those are real important aspects of data sovereignty. I will leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you very much, Ivo, for this overview, this first overview of the strategy of the European Commission. And with this, we come to the industry, and we start with Kaspar Klinger from Microsoft. You have the floor.
Thanks very much, Alexandra. And I think I should begin by apologizing for being on yet another panel. I don't know what went wrong, and I was considering to change my jacket and shirt, but luckily we had a computer that broke down, so there's a little bit of a different background, at least for this session. But thanks for having me again. I'll make sure that I don't bother you too much in the next couple of months. Listen, I think you've fascinating discussion and really a helpful introduction by Ivo. The first thing to say is, of course, that data is, I guess, the only commodity that becomes more valuable the more you have of it. And that's sort of the starting principle, I think, also for the work that we're doing in Microsoft and how we see this developing in Europe as well. And I do think that Ivo pointed to a really important aspect. We had the discussion previously on the panel about strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty. And I think in many ways, utilizing data in Europe is both an opportunity, but perhaps one could argue also one of the areas where Europe is not yet reaping the full benefits of the digital economy. And I wanted to throw a couple of numbers at you from the beginning, and we've stolen them directly from the European Commission, so all credit to them. But I think the important bit here is to look at the fact that, you know, we expect that 65% of the global economy will actually be digital by 2022, so already next year. And if Ivo won't correct me, I think the European Commission has estimated actually that the data economy will grow to, you know, staggering 829 billion euros already by 2025. So the data economy is there, and I think for enterprises, small and medium-sized enterprises, big enterprises in Europe, I look forward to what Andreas is going to say a bit later. Using data is not something you need to consider; it's something you have to do. And also with the support that we're providing from our side, Microsoft, you know, we see that in every single sector across the European economy. Data is becoming essential almost regardless of what you do. So having a data strategy, we think, is critically important. So it's also one of the reasons why we are really supportive of the different steps to be taken by the institution, not least the European Commission. We think that increased data sharing will in many ways be the best way for us to solve some of the big problems on a global level, but also on the European level. And I think Ivo pointed out to healthcare as an obvious example. You know, we've been involved in that over the last year in trying to fight the terrifying consequences of the global pandemic. What we've seen, including in the development of new vaccines, is how incredibly important data sharing really is. It's difficult to say, but we are certainly of the impression that the data sharing element is one of the reasons why we have been able to develop vaccines in such a short time span. So data sharing really matters. And I also want to complement the EU data strategy and really the emphasis on openness, on sharing, on more data collaboration, but also again striking this balance based on a European approach, where it's also about protecting what is sensitive, what is critical, personal data as well as non-personal data. And again, I think the healthcare area is a good example on where there are limitless opportunities if we can have more data sharing, but it goes without saying that personal data has to be protected to the very highest standards. We have launched our own open data campaign, which really echoes, I think, what the European Commission has put forward, being as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And we think this is one of the key enablers also in really delivering on the digital single market. We think there are a couple of areas where Europe and the European Union will perhaps need to help this progress a bit more, and that is to really provide the legal or to address the legal uncertainties around data usability, standardizations, IP rights, etc. So those might be a bit on our wish list to what we would like to see develop. And then representing a big international technology company, I think it's also important to say that we acknowledge that there is a real data divide out there, not only between different regions, but really also the fact that less than 100 companies really control almost 50% of the data that is currently around. I think we need to do something about it. It's a fundamental part of our business model that we want to make sure that we help every single company around the world, including in Europe, really use their own data, monetize their own data, see this as an opportunity for growing their businesses. And a rules-based approach, we think, as exemplified by the Data Governance Act, as well as the EU data strategy, is an important way forward. I do want to make here towards the end one sort of comment that I also alluded to in the previous panel, and that is that we do see the contours of a couple of perhaps misunderstandings around what data is, and especially around industrial data. And I'm Danish, as you can hear from my heavy accent, but if you take a wind turbine producer in Denmark as a good example, it would be wrong to assume that just because this is a European company, the data they generate, the data they can use, is really only European data. I think it doesn't matter whether you're a wind turbine producer in Denmark or whether you're a car manufacturer in Germany. The data that is being generated by these companies are really global data sets. And I think our view on this is twofold. One, we have to make sure it's absolutely essential also for Europe that data flows will continue to be possible also on a global scale. And the second thing is we want to make sure that we help diversify that data which is being generated, help companies monetize this data sets in a much more systematic way than what we've seen in the past. So I'll leave it at that. As you can hear, we are pretty enthusiastic about data, no surprise there, but we're also deeply preoccupied with doing this in a responsible way, and again, making sure that we have a global approach, global access to the transfer of data. Alexandra, thanks very much.
Thank you very much for these important insights. I really like the idea of the global data sets and how we can all achieve access to those global data sets. I think this is the problem we're trying to solve, actually. So thank you very much for really putting it on in a nutshell. And our next speaker is Professor Dr. Boris Otto. Boris, your opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Alexandra, for the introduction. Yes, I prepared a couple of slides, but before, and only two, so no worries, 2 slides. But before I would jump into those, what I would like to outline once more is the fundamental point that is also, the core of many of the data strategies that have been created recently, both on a national but also on European level. And this fundamental point is that we strive to find the right balance between making more use of the data that is there, because in particular in Europe, it's not a lack of data. We sit on treasures of data, right? But they are not used enough. And that goes along the lines of what Caspar also said. So this is the one side. But on the other hand, of course, we want to consider the interests of the data provider, the companies that create or provide the data more thoroughly that in the past that has happened. And why is the latter important? Because typically data, and in particular data of a reliable quality, does not come for free, right? It comes at a cost, right? And therefore we need to also consider, as I said, the perspectives, the interest of the data provider. So this is the one fundamental point that I'd like to make. Now, coming to Gaia, Gaia is an approach to, help us all together to find this balance between these two different and to a certain extent, contradicting interest, right? So to an approach to square the circle, if you will. And let me start with explaining once more what Gaia is not. So Gaia X is not the one and only European cloud, right? It is rather a collaborative approach to come up with a European standard for cloud services. And with saying that, I'd like to show you once more, I believe you have stepped over this view graph in the past, the overall or the high level architecture picture. So what Gaia X is aiming at is fostering ecosystems both on a data layer in this architectural view graph, which is depicted in blue, and also ecosystems of cloud service providers, which is depicted in this, well, reddish, color in the lower part of the view graph. And the X, by the way, should also illustrate a little bit that this is not a, let's say, a monolithic approach, but rather consists of many actors and players in the field, both on the blue level, where the data is actually used. As I mentioned earlier on, this is one of our objectives, to make better use and more intensive use of the data that is there, because only then it can basically unfold its value. And on the other hand, also an ecosystem, a community, a set of various cloud and edge cloud service providers. And let me also stress one thing. Saying that, it's nothing new, right? We already have that. I mean, edge cloud, far edge cloud computing is already there, and we see a lot of, let's say, applications of data-driven services as depicted in the upper chart, upper part of the chart. So what's basically the spice that, that Gaia X brings about in order to square this circle and make data sharing trustworthy, or more trustworthy as in the past, also facilitating sovereignty in the data sharing, and also being testable in terms of compliance. That is what we call the Gaia X Federation services, and that's basically the spice that Gaia brings to the soup, if you will. So talking about Gaia X, that is an initiative that has been started by the German and the French government some 1.5 years ago, and has taken up and received quite attention and basically support. So right now, what we call the Gaia X Association, which is a non-for-profit association, which forms the home for the Gaia X community, has raised interest in, I think, more than 180 partners from all across the globe. For example, SAP is a founding member. Then Microsoft, for example, has also embarked the journey. And the idea of the association is not to, as I said, to create the monolithic Euro cloud or something as mentioned earlier, but to come up with a relatively tiny set of things. The first thing, if we want to basically have a standard, we need to describe how this should work. So the first deliverable will be a standard, a document which is titled Gaia X Architecture, and describing principles, criteria, according to which we can test whether a certain service meets these criteria or not. The second thing is we need to come up with a couple of services, let's call it in the middle, because as mentioned, Gaia X is designed in a federated fashion. So multiple cloud service providers and multiple data sharing services. But somehow we need to make sure that these things find each other and are interoperable, right? And therefore we need to provide a couple of what we call federation services. By the way, let me also add, the idea that it's federated opens up many opportunities for different players in the market to join, because everybody is free to take up the idea and build Gaia X compliant services, of course. The next thing is we also do not want only to describe a standard, so write a paper and then put it in our drawer, but also we want to implement it in an open source community approach. Why? We believe that open source is an anchor of trust per se, because it's, well, it's open source. You can just read what the software does, right? So that is one thing. And the other thing, it relies on the power of the many. So everybody is free to contribute, of course. And the next thing, of course, and that was mentioned by Ivo, Gaia X sees itself as a facilitator, not as an operator or even owner, as a facilitator for the common data spaces that are, for example, called for in the European data strategy. And with that, I'd like to close a little bit my brief introduction and looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much for this interesting overview. I think I already have a lot of questions to come back to, but first we finish the first round of opening remarks, and the next one is Andreas Tegger from SAP. Andreas, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me to provide the SAP perspective on data sovereignty. And perhaps I start with a business perspective from SAP. As probably you know, we are a global leading provider of business software applications. We serve 400,000 customers around the globe in 25 industries. And we process some of the most sensitive business data for our customers. And I guess our marketing department never used the term data sovereignty, but for sure, data sovereignty, ensuring data sovereignty for our customers is part of the DNA of SAP. Otherwise, we would be out of business. That means we apply the highest standard for data security. And it also means we always keep the customer in control of their data. We would never, ever use customer data without their consent for any kind of purposes. And the same goes for data residency. While we believe we can ensure data security wherever the data resides, if the customer wants the data on its premise, on a specific location, we will make it happen. So that's the business perspective. Now, on the policy perspective of data sovereignty, let me add perhaps a global perspective of the topic. Obviously, the way I observe it, it has become a policy objective for governments across the globe. And there's nothing wrong with data sovereignty as a policy objective, provided it does not lead to protectionism. And to start with, I think it's very important to come up with a proper definition of what is data sovereignty? What is it a policy objective? And I think from a European perspective, it should mean two things. One is to ensure, or the ability to ensure, that the data of European citizens, business, and governments are processed according to European standards and values, and Ivo already mentioned. And secondly, the ability to ensure access to the underlying technology and data infrastructures for European users. Now, if you define it like this is not protectionism. This is legitimate. And then it all depends on the policy approach, the instruments that you use to achieve this objective. And I think there are three approaches that we observe globally. The first one is a rules-based approach. And I think this has been predominantly until recently in Europe to achieve this objective. And GDPR is probably the best example. It provides rules to ensure that data processing of personal data is to ensure data privacy for citizens. And you can argue this may be bad policy because it could hinder innovation, but you cannot argue this is protectionist because it applies to both European players and non-European players. Now, the concern with the rules-based approach recently has been enforcement. There has been concerns that you cannot enforce these kind of rules on some providers that are subject to conflicting rules or legislation laws in other countries, like the US Cloud Act, for example. And then the second concern is, of course, the overall erosion of the rules-based global trading order. And therefore, we have now a second complementary approach, also here in Europe, and that is to build our own capabilities to ensure data sovereignty. We have a renaissance of, you can call it digital industrial policy, to come up with our own capabilities. And again, there's nothing really wrong with an industrial policy in digital. For example, fostering R&D, fostering digital skills to build up our own capacity. And I'm also a big fan of the European data strategy. We are founding father of Gaia X. We are discussing with customers to actively participate in European data spaces. We don't see any protectionist signals in this policy, what's currently being developed in Europe. But of course, there is this third category where under the umbrella of digital sovereignty, governments around the globe pursue protectionist motivation and objectives. I would call it data protectionism. The most prominent example is forced data localization. Again, we really believe it should be the customer to decide where the data should reside, whether there should be any restrictions. And again, we make this happen. But we believe it should not be governments who should force data localization, provided the rules that they set are being observed. Okay. So to conclude, we don't see any signs, despite some statements or language coming from some capitals or some corners here in Brussels. We believe that what's currently the European digital policy, it's a rules-based approach, it's a sound industrial policy, and it's not protectionist. And we are confident that this policy will remain, because it would be a bad policy. To conclude, perhaps to say is, when I talk to governments around the globe, everybody, especially in emerging markets, is looking to Europe to set the global standards for digital policies. And if we come up with the sound policies, others could follow. But if we come up with something protectionist, it could be an invitation, a reference model for other governments to do the same thing. So with that, I would like to conclude and look forward for a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those were very interesting remarks, especially the difference between data sovereignty and protectionism. I think this is something we will have to go into later and delve into this topic a little bit more. But before we do that, we still have Marianne Terween from InnoPay, and it's time for your opening remarks. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Alexandra. Well, so what's data sovereignty? For me, it's the capability of an individual or organization to have control over data about them, and be it personal or business data. And this entails that they should be able to know which party holds what data, under what condition, where data is kept, and that you're also able to reuse that data in other places. And although, of course, we will focus on the benefits of Europe's data strategy for industries in this session, this is about something bigger, of course. Data is the new fabric of society. And this is about the larger question, what kind of society do we want to be? And I think it's very clear, underlined by the recent developments in the US, that we need to learn a whole new way to deal with data. And I work for InnoPay, a consultancy firm focusing on data sharing and digital identity. And we firmly believe in a world where we could fully embrace the opportunities of the digital transaction era by creating an open outlook, collaborating in ecosystems, and creating new value. And that is also why we started the Data Sovereignty Now campaign, together with a group of like-minded organizations active in the domain of data sharing, such as IDSA, in the International Data Spaces Association, A New Governance, CTRI, My Data Global. And we really want politicians and policymakers to make data sovereignty just as equally important as CO2 reduction. And because it's so important, it requires understanding and awareness in a broader audience. And we feel the message is really simple. Data sovereignty should be the key design principle of everything we do in the data field. And in order to do so, we need to create soft infrastructure for data sharing. And soft infrastructure consists of agreements that are made between public and private parties, agreements on the access of data. So we will have a uniform way to know how to deal with data. And it's about access. Access is the key part. It has been mentioned before as well. So it should be secure and safe, but also we need to be back in control again. And just like we did it before, I mean, some of us in the room are old enough to know that in the old days, when you had to call intercontinental, you carried 2 phones. Now, because we made protocols and agreements, and those are not just technical agreements, these are agreements about legal agreements, business agreements, operational agreements. And now we can phone the world seamlessly. So in that same thinking, we feel we need a software infrastructure that caters for portability, interoperability, and openness. So this is not about breaking up industries that we think have too much power. This is about opening them up. And so I think that's really the solution direction we have to take. And then, of course, it's all about adoption. And I feel we could do this. And of course, I echo here also what Mr. Otto just said. And I think to really pull this off, this requires a broad view and a bold approach. And I think in the EU, the momentum is here, and we cheered to the data strategy. And let's get things going.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I love that the data is the new fabric of society. I think this is why all these topics are so important. And I really do share that view that the momentum is here in Europe. I think this is going to be such an interesting year for digital affairs. So we'll see quite a lot. I would like to come back a little bit to the idea of sovereignty. How do we frame that concept? What's the last framing of data sovereignty as opposed to protectionism? I think Andreas already gave a very, very good definition. I could totally share that, but I would like to hear the others commenting maybe a little bit on that. I think Marianne already did, but maybe you would like to add on that. And maybe considering the remark I made this morning that was considered provocative about different legal environments, because when we talk about a rule-based approach, the US Cloud Act exists, and that is a different legal environment. What does that mean for all global partnerships? What is your view on this issue? This is a very concrete issue, as well as considering Gaia X, I think. We have difficult decisions to make there. So what are your insights on this? Who would like to start? Maybe Kasper, since Microsoft is directly concerned, so Ivo from the Commission, who has certainly thought about this.
I can say a few words. I don't think my approach will differ very much from what Andreas and Boris and Marianne has said already. I think for us, we recognize that these are issues that are on the increase for consumers, for our customers, but also for the political discussions across Europe. And I think the data localization aspect goes to the core of this. And it goes without saying that we also have customers that are expressing concerns, also following certain verdicts of the European Court of Justice in not too distant a background. So we get that. And I think our approach or our response to that is to say, we have to make sure that we, from a technical point of view, provides the choices that our customers and consumers are interested in Europe as well. So that's sort of on our to-do list to do. I think what was important, and what others have alluded to as well, is that it doesn't turn into data protectionism, and it doesn't turn into creating obstacles that will ultimately, in my view, and I'm a European, although I represent an American company, that ultimately, in my view, will jeopardize, I think, the opportunities for Europe in this regard. And we are day one member of Gaia X. We've been very supportive of the project from the very beginning. But since we are just among the six of us, and since nobody is listening, I think I'd also be honest in saying that our approach to Gaia X is, of course, also to emphasize that the project will be loyal to its own principles of saying this is about creating, choices. It's about creating opportunities, but it's also about making sure that Europe will have access to state-of-the-art technology. And I'm Danish, so we're permanently a little bit depressed because of the bad weather up north. So what I will say, if I'm being very pessimistic, I think we really want to make sure that we retain Europe open, and that we also make sure that European customers and consumers will not have to pay a premium price for technology at the same level as other places in the world. And I think that's the geopolitical aspect of the sovereignty discussion in Europe, to make sure that, if you want specific, very tailor-made solutions, there is generally a higher price to pay. Or ultimately, if you raise too many walls around Europe, from a competitive point of view, you might actually have access to slightly inferior technology. And I think that's something we have to bring into the debate around data sovereignty. What I would say is, I think the data localization aspect is natural, it's valid. We're seeing it across Europe. we just want to make sure that we also bring into the equation an understanding of how hyperscale cloud solutions are operating. It's not just a question of where you put the data, it's also how you process that data. So there are more nuances in this discussion that perhaps once in a while comes forward at the political level.
Thank you very much, Caspar. I definitely didn't want to doubt the good intention of Microsoft. My question was more about the legal environment, whether as a US-based...
I didn't hear you say that.
I don't want to insist. I think that the remark you made on the premium price is very important. I would like to come back to the business model later for Gaia X as well. So thank you for that. I think Boris wanted to come in on that. Did I?
Yeah, yes, that's true, Alexandra, because you also asked, well, what does data sovereignty in the end really mean? And perhaps I can add a couple of, let's say, observations from the last, 5 years, because I supported many data sharing projects. And what we learned is that, let's say, data sovereignty is one key fact, but it materializes as a set of different requirements. And the one thing is, for example, transparency. Many companies just want to know what happens with that data once shared, because often today it's not the case. You give your data to another party and then never hear anything, right? And do not know what happens with the data and algorithms like that. The other thing is, of course, sovereignty, but not in a, let's say, protective sense that has mentioned a couple of times, but rather in the sense of, let's call it, terms and conditions in the data economy. Well, I want to be able, I want to have a capability to express what I want to see happen with my data and what not, right? And that simply does not exist. For example, you can use my data until a certain point in time has arrived. You can use my data 3 times, but not often. You can use my data, but not forward it to somebody else, right? These kind of things that make use cases, come to life. There is no means right now to do that, neither, at least not in a standard way. The other thing is, a third aspect, I don't want to be locked in. And that is, of course, a big threat or that user companies have when it comes to data sharing, right? That they basically are, let's say, forced to a certain extent or embark into a platform environment where they basically then are logged in. And I think that also coming back to what Caspar and also Andreas said is what Gaia X wants to do is to come up with a technical instrument to support these requirements. That's basically it. And Gaia X is also not, because that was a question I read in the chat from Eline Chivot, I hope I pronounce it correctly. Gaia X does not want to do a ranking of service providers. And Gaia X will also not tell which service is better than the other, because in the end, and that goes back to Caspar and also Andreas' words, in the end, it's the choice of the user, right? I mean, but what we want to achieve is that they also have a choice for a service or a cloud service which basically meets transparency, sovereignty, and no login, portability, and interoperability. And that is not what I'm saying. That is, let's say, what has been articulated by the user community. That does not exist to a sufficient extent. And that is why we together come up with an architecture that we call Gaia X, right?
Yeah, maybe I can add to that.
I would just like to read out a question that came in, because it relates directly to what you're saying. So maybe you can reflect on that as well, if that's relevant. The question is, data sovereignty in regard to a person's or company's own data is fine, but what about data generated by customers using online services?
Yeah.
Should be protected in this case. And with this, I go to Marianne, and then we still have Ivo and Andreas.
Sure. Right. Mariana, is it? Or should I start, or Mariana? Please.
Oh, you go ahead.
I think you have some time. I'll give you time later again. I would like Marianne to have Marianne.
Well, I think as Boris just said, a quote from Commissioner Vestager that I really liked is, GDPR gave us rights, but no means to exercise those rights. And that's what this is about. We need to have ways to know how to deal with data. And with InnoPay, we facilitated actually kind of what is now hopefully becoming the concept of a data space. In the data strategy, the concept of data space is really paramount. And I think for industries, that's a really powerful concept where we also can thrive and innovate. And we facilitated a kind of soft infrastructure that's similar to what a data space could be, which is called iShare, for sharing data in logistics. And there you saw happening exactly what Mr. Otto just pointed out. In logistics, companies they want to share data, but they're hesitant because what if I share my data? Everybody knows competitive information about me. But if you can license this data, if you can say you can use this data, but only at the certain time slot when you were supposed to pick up the loads, or only to use for planning purposes, or only whatever reason you can think of, and you can license it and authorize people how to use your industrial data. That's really powerful. And I think that's what a soft infrastructure is about, agreeing consent mechanisms. And of course, also digital identity is a very important element of such a soft infrastructure. And that's why I think this whole discussion it's so important, and also needs to broaden outside this room. And we need to have a collaborative approach also within the EU, with all these topics aligned to reach the same goal.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Ivo, want to come in on this?
Yeah, no, thanks. A few reflections on different points that have been raised. The first one is the point on protectionism. And when we brought out the data strategy, I got questions from people, is this data strategy against anyone? No, the data strategy is not against anyone. It's about the way in which we want to do data in Europe, in line with our values. Now, I think that is in itself a definition of data sovereignty. On top of that, of course, at a different level, it has been mentioned, giving individuals and companies control over the data they generate. That's also an aspect of data sovereignty. And there I would like to link with the question out of the chat from Ad. So what about user-generated data, where actually there's companies that have made investments to make this happen? Now, there may be indeed different legitimate interests around the same data. You could have the data, the producer of the object. You could have the buyer of the object. You could have people in the aftermarket who have a very legitimate interest to get hold of the data. You could have the common good as a legitimate purpose for getting the data. Now, that is something we're going to look at in the Data Act. How can you adjudicate between these different legitimate interests, while at the same time making the data cake bigger, because it's not a static thing. If you have more people using the data, the cake is much bigger. It's not like a house that you can only use with so many people. The interesting thing is that you want to make the data cake bigger. And once you manage to make the data cake bigger, well, you will have a bigger piece. Everyone will have a bigger piece, but unless you adjudicate some value, it's not going to happen. It will be just a very small cake and everyone will keep the data to themselves. To come back to your question, Alexandra, about the different legal environments, it's a very important one. Conflicting legislation that make it impossible for companies to take a course of action that's legal. Now, we are trying to address that in the Data Governance Act for the topics covered by the Data Governance Act by saying, yes, you have to have measures in place to avoid that against European legislation, European data is going to law enforcement in countries that don't have the same protection in place that is necessary, and where there's no agreement, where there's no treaty, for example, or a collaboration agreement on law enforcement. The last point, and it's about momentum. Definitely, momentum is here, but we have to get it right. I mean, we won't get a second chance. This is really a turning point in the data economy, and we have to act, and we have to get it right. Thanks.
Thank you. Boris, you wanted to come in, and Andreas, I think as well, I imagine?
Yes.
It's sort of, but yeah, I think Boris was really wanting to come in on this.
Yeah, because I wanted to touch once more, which was also addressed in the second last chat comment, about basically who owns the data. And I mean, in these discussions, which are of course tricky, as we all know, and Ivo outlined that already, we always come to a point where we ask ourselves, okay, what's the purpose of for which we want to use the data? And that is also, I think, the point that I would like to also stress. Right now, our discussion in about, well, data sharing or using data is usually pretty much driven by black and white perspectives. You are either allowed to access the data or not. You are either allowed to use the data or not. But reality is a little bit more complex. What we need to have is to fine-tune these usage rights in a more continuum way. And that is exactly what we have in mind with, let's say, usage control and policies that we can attach to the data. So, and with the International Data Spaces Initiative, over the last 5 years, we have come up, let's say, with a language to articulate these more sophisticated usage rights, right? And the good thing is also that this language is machine readable, because that's what we need. We don't want to have, let's say, make use of our legal departments in every single use case, but want to basically let the services negotiate automatically under which conditions data assets can be used or not. And I believe that this granularity is an important aspect in the data sharing economy. And because, as I said, right now it's black and white only, and that does not help us really help us out, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Boris. I think the underlying theme behind the granularity is also trust, because this requires the customer to trust the structure it confers. He confers the data to really do what they desire. I think that is the basic problem. That at least as consumers, we have this feeling we entrust our data to someone, and then we don't know what happens, or we don't. So I think this is really an important change we have to bring about, but we have to generate the trust that the subject we are giving the data to will really follow our instructions. I think I suppose this is similar for business. So yeah, that's the underlying theme.
Can I make a very, very short remark on this? Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, no, I just wanted to say two things, and I know others have alluded to this already. I think the good thing about where we are right now is that actually technology also provides opportunities for addressing some of these concerns. It gives consumers the opportunity to choose. Are they concerned about IP rights? There is a technology solution to that. Do we protect the data that we generate? Absolutely. I think the point that was brought forward and by you and others in, what about the data that are being generated by users? I think here it's of course linked directly also to the question of what business model that the companies are using. And again, I think, what is happening in Europe, what the European Commission is putting forward, including in the very broad regulatory agenda coming forward, is really also about increasing the accountability for companies. Now, we embrace that. Does it mean that we agree with everything? No, not necessarily. But with most of it, we do. And then there might be a couple of areas where we would encourage the European Commission to make sure there's predictability, that we know exactly how we, comply with what is being brought forward. But the basic foundation of also increasing accountability and responsibility in the industry, I think, is a fundamental part of the Brussels approach, if you like, to where we are on data sharing today.
Yeah, Andreas, I'm giving you the floor. I just wanted to bring in one more question from the audience, because I'm not sure whether we'll have time left after that. I have another question I think is very important about the business model. The question is, what about data of SMEs or other businesses? Should they have similar rights over the data and the data they generate on platforms? I think they should have, but maybe you would like to confirm that, Andreas, while answering.
No, I just wanted to make a general comment. What I think is quite important when we talk about access by governments to data, this is not something we as industry can solve with security standards, with whatever we can do. This can only be solved by governments, right? So we are hopeful that with the new Biden administration, the EU and the US can come up with a common standard, an agreement on law enforcement and data access. Everything else will not solve the situation. Full stop. I mean, it's simple as that, right? The second point I want to make is the other issues from a B2B perspective, from an industrial perspective for data is when you start sharing data across value chain, across industries, which is greenfield, right? We really need common legal standards and soft standards, templates, contractual arrangements. And what I like about what we're doing in Europe, we are the first region to establish this framework, which could then become a global framework in OECD and others. I think that is often neglected, that we are shaping those global standards, and I believe it could be market driven. I think this is really terrific what we are doing here.
Thank you very much. I would go on with a topic that's a little bit different, that was introduced a little bit, I think, by Caspar. That was a premium price. We don't want Europe to pay a premium price. At this moment, there are cloud space providers that are extremely competitive. I mean, the elephant in the room we are having is Gaia X or whatever else we can come up with Europe. When they be able to generate really to have a business case, because probably when you start fresh with this technology, you won't be able to compete on price. So how do you see that? Do you share this view? And what can Europe do? What can the European Commission and the European Parliament do in terms of legislation to make sure there is a business case for European data space? Go ahead, Boris.
Perhaps I can speak from a Gaia X perspective. As I mentioned, I mean, Gaia X will not be a market player in the sense that we basically offer, let's say, something that is comparable to one of the large cloud service provider offering. This is not the case. But Gaia X will offer a couple of services in the middle, and they need to be able to be run in a, let's say, sustainable fashion. But these will be probably organized in a cooperative fashion, let's call it like that, right? So it will be also analogous to other infrastructures, be something that is, let's say, for the greater good, let's call it like that. So it's not a profit maximizing idea. That's for sure. The other thing is, so basically then the question of the business model goes back to the individual providers that make the decision to be Gaia X compliant, right? Because what is also true with Gaia X, but also with other things like IDS and so on, we build technical overhead. Let's be very frank with that. So that is something that comes on top. There is something more as we are used to have. However, the benefit that we get for this overhead is what you just said, Alexandra. It's trust and a greater deal of sovereignty. So, and in the end, it will be also up to the users if they are willing to pay this price or not. So, I mean, if they are interested in this surplus of trust and sovereignty, then they will definitely pay the price. I truly believe that it's a differentiator for cloud service providers to comply with Gaia X because it sets them apart from others who don't. Right, and I also believe that in Europe there is a high demand for these kind of things, as mentioned earlier. But talking about business models, the question about the business models of a cloud service provider, I need to forward to Andreas and to Caspar. Talking about the business model of Gaia X, it will be a cooperative one. And perhaps that as a last comment, that is something that we see popping up quite over the place, right? For example, if you look into the data space mobility in Germany, there are plans to also found a cooperative, a non-for-profit limited company to operate these kind of thing for the greater good, because we all use the infrastructure, as Mariana said, and infrastructures are usually not run with a traditional profit maximizing business model in mind.
Yeah, I would like to talk.
I think Mariana wanted to speak, but I'll give the floor to everybody. Don't worry. So Mariana, maybe next. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think I completely agree with you, Boris. And I mean, for me, it's also about examples. So what is data sovereignty? Data sovereignty is also about I'm shopping at a certain web shop and I can take my profile with me to another web shop, or I use a search engine, and they have my profile, my search criteria, what have you, and I can port them to another search engine. Or I'm at a certain social platform which I want to leave, but I can still communicate with my friends when I enter a new social platform, which means if any of you would start a social platform tomorrow, I could give you a chance. If you would offer me a month free subscription, I could say, well, why can't I try this new rookie platform? Because I can still communicate with my friends. And that's what data sovereignty is about. And that's why it's so important. And it's not just about not being protectionist, but it's also about thriving innovation, deep innovation. So I think if you look now to the DSA and the DMA, we're really cheered to those developments, but they're traffic lights. Like, okay, what do we have to do to stop what's happening now, and what can we do to prevent, what's happening now? But if you really look at the root cause, I think we would need this soft infrastructure that enables also innovation in a way that I just described.
So if I might answer the question about, how can the European data spaces be successful, I think there are three main elements to it. One is there must be a business interest, a use case that there are incentives for business users, companies to share data. If there is no value proposition, there's no incentive to share data. So you should not start with that. Everybody should share data, and then we see what we can do with it. It's the other way around. You first need a value proposition, and then you find incentives for sharing data. Secondly, you need technical standards to facilitate data sharing. There's a huge amount of work to be done in this area, especially when you cross industries. We don't have the standards. And thirdly, the governance. As soon as a company gets the feeling, I lose control, there's no incentive for data sharing. So that goes back to the governance.
That's the next question I'm going to ask, but I would first like to give everybody the floor who want to come in on this one. Maybe Ivo or Caspar, you can.
Yeah, I would be happy to. Just two short remarks before we go to the governance. Now, on the Cloud Federation and the question of the premium price, I don't think the idea is that we will have a clunky European copy of what is out there in the market. You have to look at it also in a dynamic way, with processing moving towards the edge. Security is going to be more and more important. Green, the energy consumption, so do it in a low energy consumption way. Those are the elements for the cloud of the future, and that is what actually we should invest in terms of the data infrastructures and the European cloud infrastructures. I saw a question in the chat by Britt about the SMEs and platforms, and Marianne has already given the answer in a way. There are pretty strong requirements in the proposal of the Commission in the Digital Market Acts in that respect. So please have a close look at that.
Great, thank you. Caspar, would you like to come in on this aspect? Or
I think I've said a few things already, but I think from our point of view, just going back to the point that Ivo mentioned before, yes, things are moving increasingly towards the edge, but the foundation for moving to the edge will remain, the cloud. So I think we will continue to sort of focus a lot on providing state-of-the-art cloud solutions also for the European market. And it's interesting, one aspect that I often hear, which people might get a little bit wrong, is that it's in fact not only the big enterprises that are benefiting tremendously from going to the cloud. What we're seeing, including from our own business, is actually the biggest difference is made from small and medium-sized enterprises that will leapfrog by simply going to the cloud. And I think, again, I don't hear anybody disagreeing on that. I'm really happy also with Boris's emphasis on what Gaia X is about. Are we against competition? Absolutely not. Are we against having consumers, enterprises getting a freer choice through interoperability? Absolutely not. I think those are very valid, very legitimate desires of Europe. What we are just concerned about is, of course, will it be more difficult for us to provide state-of-the-art technology to the European economy And if the answer is yes, then I do think one should not underestimate, of course, the consequences for the European economy. But I think that's why these multi-stakeholder conversations, where we're able also to provide our views and opinions on the draft regulations being taken forward or being invited inside Gaia X, is the right way forward. And I remained of the opinion that I think Europe is in many ways going to set the global standards on defining what data sovereignty means. And I think we just have to make sure that we nudge Europe in a direction that is completely consistent with the legacy of Europe, of being an open region, being loyal to international trade. And today it's not only about moving BMW from Germany to the US or back again. It's really also about moving data, because that is such a foundational part of how the economy is going to be also in the next couple of years.
Yeah, thank you very much. And you're always giving me a key word for the next question. I love that. Thank you much for that. And this time the key word was the legacy of Europe, to be in line with the legacy of Europe. And I think that is very much in line with the Gaia X project. The legacy of Europe is also being a large network of cities, a network of country, a network of languages. And the European institutions really epitomize this kind of network, and the European Commission are the governance for this network. So what about the governance of Gaia X? Because when you showed that graph before, and I've seen it before, I get a little bit confused on who is deciding what there. How is if I have to call Europe, who do I have to call? And I was thinking, well, if I have to talk to Gaia,
yes. And all of us will listen very carefully here, Boris.
Yes, that's true. That is true.
So it's going to do that. So first question to do, and we have been accorded 5 more minutes because we're supposed to be very interesting. So that's a compliment, I think, for the show. But please be very brief, something like 50 seconds in order to fit into the last 5 minutes, 50 minutes each. And Boris, I think, starts the extra.
So as I said, Gaia X Association is a community effort, right? So every member has one vote. And equal votes, that's for sure. So in the end, the decisions on the technical standards are done in the technical committee, and everybody is free to participate in the working groups and has equal voting rights. There is a caveat, though, of course, that, let's say, the top governance body, the board of directors, is open only for companies with their headquarters in the European Union. And but on the other hand, as I said, working in the committees and the working groups is something that is open for everybody, and the smallest company as a member has the same voting rights as the large corporate. So it's really something that is, well, as I said, democratic, and that's also the value, because talking about trust, Gaia X is from the community for the community, and that is something that is really an asset, to be honest, and to my point of view, a very European approach.
Thank you very much. Marianne, your 50 seconds. You're still muted?
The remark of the century. I feel it's really simple. We need to make data sovereignty a key design principle, create a software infrastructure, and this is a multi-stakeholder effort. Like Andreas just said, the government has a large stake. And I think there's a hidden gem in the DGA, which talks about the institution of a data innovation board, where public and private parties can really get this thing going. And we really believe in such a strategic board to pull this off. And we also believe that we could enhance this with an data exchange board. So really, not just the strategic part, but also the tactical part. So for me, that's what this is all about.
Great. Thank you very much, Marianne. Casper.
Listen, I think my only short remark, because I've been speaking way too much, sorry about that, is that I think it's very important that we don't have this discussion, whether we talk about the technical aspects or the policy aspects, driven by fear. And I'm not indicating that this discussion has in any way been along those lines. On the contrary, I think we've been talking about the opportunities that the data really brings. And I'm not saying this to diminish the necessity of us focusing on critical areas where data has to be, protected to the very highest standards. But I think what the data strategy, the Data Governance Act that Marianne just mentioned as well, where the positive side of that comes forward is on the focus of empowering through the use of data. And I think that's a fundamental aspect, whether you talk about GaiaX or the work that Ivo and his colleagues do in the European Commission. But I think also the role that the industry can play in support of moving Europe even more into the digital age.
Thank you very much, Caspar. Andreas?
Yeah, as I said before, I think Europe has a unique opportunity, and I think we are on the right track to set the global standards for not just data sovereignty, but the new framework for data sharing in a market-driven and open way. And we're fostering innovation and competitiveness. So I think we're on track, despite, again, some statements, languages from some capitals, from some corners in the European Commission. But I think at the end of the day, what comes out of this process is quite promising.
Thank you very much. And the European Commission has been called into cause. Ivo, what are your last comments?
In a positive way. We've got other comments. So no, just a comment on the data spaces that well, more or less I ended with in my introduction. Now, if you ask in the Commission people what are the common European data spaces, it's interesting that engineers say this is about data infrastructures, this is about technology, and the lawyers say this is about legislation. Now, actually, data spaces are the combination of technical infrastructures and governance, including legislation, including the set of rules and agreements and standards that Marianne was talking about. A very last comment, the Data Innovation Board, I fully agree with you, Marianne, that's a gem, but I don't think it's so hidden. Actually, we should make sure that it gets, it gets powerful. Yep.
Thank you all very much. I think this was a very interesting discussion. I really learned a lot, and I will follow up on a lot of things you have brought up. So thanks to the audience for your attention. I hope you liked it. Thanks for your questions. And I'll hand the floor back to James Willman from Forum Europe. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Alexandra, and thank you to all of the speakers for this session and indeed across the day. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us. And on behalf of the team at Forum Europe, I'd like to extend our thanks once again to MEPs Blanco, Maydell, Giza, and Cavazzini for their cooperation around this event. And also to Microsoft, to Quant, to It's Me, Huawei, InnoPay, Nokia, Ericsson, SAP for representing the very important business perspectives alongside the senior European Commission officials, including Ivo, who we've just heard from, I thought was excellent for their time and their energy. Very briefly, all the recordings for the event will be published and sent out to everyone shortly. And as always, if you have any questions about this event or anything that we have in the pipeline, don't hesitate to get in touch. Full details are online at www.forum-europe.com. So it's been a really fascinating day. I'm not going to keep anybody any longer, other than to say thank you very much once again, and hope to see you all very soon. So thanks.